I imagine a lot of you have noticed that violence has become something of a hot topic in our world these days, especially here in the United States where I live. And so I thought I'd make a video about exploring what I see as the root cause of a lot of it. And in my view, that root cause has to do with a pervasive deficit of meaning in our lives, a chronic lack of a deep sense of purpose, the kind of sense that would easily allow us to transcend the impulse to visit mindless violence on our neighbors. Basically, I'd like to explore the possibility that a lot of our problems with violence are mostly an expression of the meaninglessness and consequently the hopelessness of life as we currently know it. That we're violent mostly because our souls are hollow and empty, at both an individual level as well as at the level of our shared cultural enterprise. And I think that sort of realization is important for several reasons, not least of which would be that hardly anyone is talking about it. Certainly not our pundits and politicians. To me, that's the huge elephant in the living room that almost no one wants to mention. And because of that, I'd say that our problems with violence will never go away. Our world will never begin to heal until we start to recognize that our problems lie mostly within our own hearts and souls, in how we breathe and sweat and move from moment to moment. But the thing is that we hardly ever change in those fundamental ways just because one politician happens to be in office as opposed to another one. And so, in my view, almost all of the political posturing about violence in our world is really little more than a form of theater, a kind of feckless pantomime designed to deflect our attention away from the actual sources of our problems, which ultimately lie within ourselves. Anyhow, with all of that in mind, I suppose I should begin by talking a bit about the nature of meaning. And here, I'd like to acknowledge a debt to Viktor Frankl's famous little book called Man's Search for Meaning. According to Frankl, life becomes meaningful when we're striving to fulfill some worthwhile goal. In other words, it's not about arriving at some idyllic destination or about espousing some supposedly correct doctrine or about believing that certain assertions are true while others are false. Instead, meaning is about the ongoing struggle to make something worthwhile out of our lives, about dwelling in the difficult and often painful tension between what our lives are and what they could be. Consequently, meaning can vary a lot from person to person. As the old adage goes, one man's meat is another man's poison. And it can even change quite a bit as we grow and develop over time. After all, the meanings that filled our hearts when we were 10 years old are probably very different from the ones that inspire us now. Basically, the upshot is there's really no such thing as a singular meaning of life that will automatically fulfill every soul on planet Earth, no matter who we are or where we are on our journeys. Instead, meaning is a matter of taking up the very personal adventure of creating and recreating a worthwhile sense of purpose as we move through our time in this world. A purpose that's deep enough to fill our souls with beauty, power, and significance, day by day and moment by moment. Something that imbues our lives with a palpable sense of destiny. But at this point, maybe you're thinking, well, okay, but what does all of that have to do with violence? And here, I'd like to propose that a lot of the violence in our world these days results from an underlying failure of meaning and meaningful living. The reason is that when we've located a deep and resonant sense of purpose, we suddenly have something a lot better to do than to go around bludgeoning or murdering our neighbors. Of course, I guess it's always possible to argue that violence can itself be construed as a meaningful, worthwhile goal. And perhaps in some cases that's true, especially if you happen to be some sort of sadist or serial killer or maybe an aspiring megalomaniacal dictator. But for the rest of us, I'd say that committing violence doesn't do much to satisfy our souls. And I think that at the end of the day, that kind of satisfaction is what most of us really want out of life. We want to experience something that calls out the very best in us, the most noble parts of who and what we are, and that helps us transcend the confines of our limitations, even if it also involves a fair amount of struggle and hard work. What we really want is to consummate our time in this world, to bring our existence to its most sublime and satisfying zenith. And when all of that's happening, when we're caught up in the mad, delirious dance of it all, and life is sounding its irresistible cadence, rumbling like the distant thunder of an oncoming storm, well, there's really very little motivation to indulge in violence, mostly because at that point, life already feels sufficient and satisfying, already self-explanatory, and already complete. At that point, what's happening is that we're existing in a state of psychological abundance rather than psychological destitution. And so any impulse to commit violence would seem trivial in comparison to what we're already experiencing. Basically, when we're living in a state of psychological abundance, it's easy to shake off life's minor annoyances when they happen, because at that point, our spirits have become too big for the triviality of violence. But to be realistic about it, all of that probably seems like a pretty tall order. But why? Why does living a meaningful life of psychological abundance seem so difficult so much of the time? Well, I suspect that a big part of the answer has to do with something I talked about in my last video, namely, the fact that we tend to live a large fraction of our lives in a two-dimensional world defined by production and consumption on one hand, and by entertainment and boredom on the other. And living in that flattened out space tends to exclude life's depth dimension, which is where things like meaning, purpose, and wisdom are usually born in the first place. And so it's pretty difficult to find a deep sense of meaning in a world that's constantly pulling us back into that two-dimensional space, constantly distracting us and constantly encouraging us to fill our consciousness with things that aren't really feeding our souls. And if you don't think that's really happening, well, try turning on your TV sometime. An example. Let's see if we can think of an example. Have you ever noticed how much of today's news is basically about making us feel either afraid or angry? Or maybe some combination of the two. In other words, a lot of it's trying to appeal to the relatively primitive reptilian sectors of our brain, the parts that govern our fight or flight responses, or occasionally the paleo-mammalian parts, which have to do with things like territoriality and dominance hierarchies. But in any case, have you noticed how infrequently the media try to appeal to our higher cortical functions, like our ability to create meaning or our capacity for wisdom? And so when you think about it, is it any surprise to discover that we're living in a violent world? It's partly because we're constantly being drawn away from the realm of meaning and towards seeing the world in terms of things like anger and fear, basically reptilian fight or flight responses. In other words, our world is violent partly because today's mass media are constantly trying to turn us all into lizards. But why is that? Why are the media so fixated on appealing to the more primitive sectors of our minds? Well, the first answer is probably the most obvious one. That's what sells. And it sells for some very good reasons. First, Contrary to popular opinion, we actually enjoy feeling angry and afraid. And we love to hate, too, and to have enemies we can hate. That's partly because those sorts of emotions give us an easy sense of orientation to the world and an easy sense of ourselves, too. They make everything seem relatively simple and straightforward, especially by hearkening back to a bygone epoch when human evolution was driven more by the simplicity of genes than by the symbolic complexity of memes. When all we had to worry about was whether to fight our enemies or run from them. And so it turns out that anger and fear have become very marketable commodities in our complicated world because while everything may seem dark and foreboding when we're caught in the thrall of those kinds of sensations, at least the world seems like something we can understand. And so the media have grown extremely adept at spinning narratives and showing us images that make us feel that way. However, beyond simplifying our world, the great spectacle of anger and fear also sells because underneath all of the trappings of modern civilization, there's still a strange, visceral thrill in witnessing other people's suffering, especially when we're eager to think of them as our enemies. Basically, anger and fear are intoxicating partly because of the phenomenon of schadenfreude, which is about the pleasure we feel when we witness other people's misfortune and pain. Of course, it's not necessarily an easy thing to admit something like that, most of all to ourselves. But that doesn't make it any less true. In fact, it's as common as the morbid fascination we feel when we slow down to gawk at a gory accident on the highway. Part of that probably has to do with simple curiosity, but another part has to do with the darker and more visceral thrill of schadenfreude. The band Tool captures that dynamic pretty well. In their song Vicarious, they sing, "Eye on the TV, 'cause tragedy thrills me, whatever flavor it happens to be like." And then a little later in the chorus, "'Cause I need to watch things die from a distance. Vicariously I live while the whole world dies. You all need it too, don't lie." And so, as they say in our mass media driven world, if it bleeds, it leads. That's because blood sells, and it always has, all the way from the Colosseum of ancient Rome to today's technologically sophisticated mass media. So, once again I ask, is it any wonder that we live in a world filled with so much mindless violence, and where meaning is a relatively scarce commodity? Personally, I don't find it surprising at all. And I don't think it's merely a product of historical happenstance either. In fact, I'd say that that's exactly how power wants things to be. The reason is that it's a lot easier to control a populace when it's caught in the grip of anger and fear and divided against itself. And here I'd like to mention something I explored a bit in my last video. The idea that it's not actually in power's interest for us to be creating unique and powerful meanings for our lives. That's in power's interest, that's in power's interest only insofar as it happens to align with power's agendas. But meaning, especially at the personal level, doesn't necessarily work that way. In fact, living a meaningful life can easily carry us toward realizing just how appallingly superficial and manipulative power's hierarchical games really are. And power definitely doesn't want us to perceive anything like that. Better to keep us all angry and afraid and at each other's throats. And then to count the victims of violence as a necessary form of collateral damage. And so, at this point, the natural question is probably, well, okay, but what can we do about it? Not only collectively, but more importantly, at the level of our everyday individual lives. If meaning is at least a partial corrective to the violence besetting our age, then how can we begin to steer ourselves and our world in a more meaningful direction? Well, I think that there are several things we can do right away, but they're not necessarily easy. The first thing we can do, if you'll permit me a slight vulgarity, is to stop filling our minds with bullshit. That's important because part of what makes meaning such a difficult thing is that our consciousness is usually clogged with garbage, with endless distraction and triviality, with imbecility disguised as news and entertainment, and with the steady diet of toxicity that the mass media keep feeding us. Basically, the first thing we can do is to drop the nasty habit of settling. Settling for shallow, second-rate answers to life's riddle, and to start living more in life's depth dimension, more along the axes of genuine spirituality and self-actualization, for instance, as I described in my last video. At the same time, I'd say that we can start cultivating a particular kind of consciousness, the kind that's more self-aware, wiser, and more sensitively attuned to life's subtle intimations of meaning. The kind that's able to perceive the wider horizon of things, to relate to the universe and to the condition of life itself. The kind of consciousness that's both incandescently passionate and precise, and that can treat our time in this world as the boundless adventure it actually is. In essence, the thing we can do is to liberate our souls day by day and moment by moment. In other words, we can allow ourselves to become something that I call agents of the infinite. The sort of human beings who may seem quite ordinary at first, but who are actually fostering the advent of a bold and brilliant universe. People whose very presence begins to liberate the souls of the people around us automatically. What we can do is we can become heralds of the utter miracle of transcendence and becoming. And if all of that sounds way too unrealistic, as I suppose it easily can in a blinkered two-dimensional world like ours, if life as you know it seems far too mired in the banality of mindless violence and far too bereft of any deep and resonant meaning, well then, let me remind you of something. It's something that Albert Camus once famously said. In the midst of winter, I found there was within me an invincible summer. And so, my final exhortation to you would be, do whatever you can to find that invincible summer within yourself. Even if everything around you seems hopelessly frozen and bleak, see if you can feel it, if only for a moment or two. The heat of that sultry season blazing like a furnace somewhere inside of your soul. And then, day by day, see if you can learn to live toward it. That's something I think we can do. Okay, anyhow, I guess that's my little homily for today. Thanks for listening. I definitely appreciate your time and your attention. And of course, as always, take care of your soul.